Hi everybody, TJ Mack of Vintage Cards and Nostalgia here. It's been a little while since my last video. I've been busy traveling for work and with life in general. Now things should be slowing down a little bit with the holidays coming up upon us. And I just love this time of year as someone who values nostalgia. The holiday season brings back a lot of warm memories for me. And Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday because I enjoy watching the parade, eating turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes. You get a day full of football, and most importantly, time spent with family. Now, as far as collecting goes, I find myself in some ways returning to my roots of collecting. Back when I was a kid, I would collect baseball cards, mainly in the spring and summer, because that's when I saw them most. It was the most meaningful time because you would open the packs and you get your favorite players and you'd see them on TV or read about them in the newspaper, and you just felt that connection. Then, as we transitioned into fall and then winter, I would find myself collecting football and hockey cards because growing up in the Buffalo area, those were the sports we followed and the cards that filled the shelves at places like Impson's Pharmacy and Wilson Farms, which were two of the corner stores near my house. I've been adding a lot of 50s and 60s hockey cards to my collection lately because it's an area that I really want to grow more. I have plenty of baseball and football cards, but it's really hockey from that time that I want to have more represented. I really love the history of the game. It's one that I don't know as much about as I do with baseball and football, but part of collecting these types of cards, it really motivates me to read more about those players and just understand the era. And I can see myself over time adding a wider variety of cards based on learning about the players that played at that time. So, what I'm looking to do right now is I want to add between 12 and 18 cards from each of the hockey sets from 1953 Parkhurst through 1967 Tops. Now, from 53 and 54 Parkhurst, they had all six of the original hockey teams at that time in the NHL, which were the Red Wings, the Blackhawks, the Rangers, the Bruins, the Maple Leafs, and the Canadiens. Starting in 54, Tops had the four U.S. teams, and Parkhurst continued to make a set with all six teams. But in 55, Parkhurst just went to the Canadian teams, so they had the Leafs and the Montreal Canadiens. Tops did not make a set that year. 56, neither company made a set at that time. And then starting in 57, Tops had the four U.S. teams. Parkhurst continued to do the two Canadian teams all the way through 1959. Starting in 1960, Parkhurst added the Red Wings, and then Tops only went to the Bruins, the Rangers, and the Blackhawks. Stayed that way till 1963. And then in 64, Tops took over, making all six of the NHL teams at that time. From 1964 to 1967, Tops distributed all the cards into Canada for the original six teams. And after 1967, there was a Topps set that was issued to the United States, and then you had O-Pee-Chee that was issued in Canada, and it would continue that way for many years after that. So in the 50s and the 60s, Topps hockey cards generally were not available in the United States unless they somehow came over the border to be sold here, but they were meant to be distributed just in Canada. Now, on the back of the 50s cards, and I'll show it on the back of a 58 Topps card I'm going to show you today, it'll say printed in the United States on them because back then they were printed in the US. But you'll see in some of the later Topps cards, they'll say printed in Canada on the back because that's where they were distributed at that time, is in Canada. So these cards can be a little bit tougher to come by than cards of baseball and football that were distributed throughout the United States. But they're not overly hard to get if you're patient and you're just waiting for the right examples for your collection. Now I'm doing 12 to 18 cards for each year. That's going to put me, I estimated, about 324 cards to cover the time frame that I want to. I already have about 64 of them, so that leaves me with about 230 more that I have to get to that number. So it's going to take me a few years to do. I'm not planning on adding many of the rookies from the 50s into the early 60s because, in the condition I collect, they just get very, very expensive. Like, for example, a 1955 Parkhurst Jacques Plante card and a PSA 5. It's probably about a $2,200 card. A 58 Topps Bobby Hall rookie and a PSA 5 sold in January 2024 for over $2,700. Even a lesser Hall of Famer, still a great player, in Frank Mahavlich, his 1957 Parkhurst card sold in 2023 in a PSA 5 for over $1,500. So I'm just not into buying cards that are that expensive. I'm still going to put together a very nice collection of hockey cards from that era. So now let's take a look at 5 cards I recently picked up that I want to share with you today. First card I want to share is this 1965 Topps Stan Mikita. This is the 6th card I've added from this set to my collection. And it's got this beautiful, vibrant blue background. And Mikita was the premier center of his era, and he was just a year away at this time from winning back-to-back Hart trophies as the league MVP. Now, for the decade of the 1960s, he was third in total points with 767, trailing only Gordie Howe and then also his Blackhawks teammate Bobby Hall. He was first in assists, though, with 482, and then fifth in goals with 286. Mikita was one of the early players to wear a helmet after an errant puck took off part of his ear in 1967. He was just a tremendous player and one of the keys if you're building a 1960s hockey collection. And now I'm going to show you what the back of the card looked like. You can see here on the back both the French and English translations. Again, these cards were only distributed in Canada during that time and not available in the US. Next card I want to show is this 1961 Topps Doug Harvey. This was in my hockey display case I showed in my last video. I've been looking to add this card for a few years, and I finally found one I like at a reasonable price. It doesn't come up for sale very often. The 61 top set, there are only 50 cards, and most of them have this background with like a game image, as you can see behind Andy Bathgate there. But Harvey is shown with this bright yellow background because in this set, the coach and rookie cards had these types of backgrounds. And you can see that Harvey is in his Rangers uniform because he was traded in the offseason from the Canadian to the Rangers, and the Rangers actually made him a player coach, and he is the last player coach that we've had in NHL history. And the Rangers really breathed new life into Harvey. He ended up winning his 7th Norris Trophy as the league's best defenseman, and that's still tied for second most in NHL history behind Bobby Orr. I just love the look of this card. I'm a big Doug Harvey fan. I think he was the standard for NHL defensemen up until Bobby Orr came along later on, and he's still one of the best to ever play the game. And I think his cards are a really good value considering how great a player he was. And just a beautiful, vibrant image on this card, and I couldn't be happier with it. Here is the back of the card with printed in Canada in the middle right. Next up is this 1958 Topps card of Ted Lindsay. He was the best left winger of the 1950s. With the nickname Terrible Ted, he was one of the toughest and meanest players in the league at the time. He stood only 5'8" and weighed about 160 pounds, but he was a feared player who was not to be messed with. But he was also highly skilled. He finished 5th in goals during the 1950s with 232, 3rd in assists with 325, and 2nd in points behind his teammate Gordie Howe with 557. He was also the penalty minutes leader with 1,188, which was over 165 minutes more than the second place player of the time. He's shown here in his Blackhawks uniform, but most of his career was with the Red Wings. I just love the two-tone design of this card. Now I'm going to show you the back of the card where you can see printed in the US. As I mentioned, these cards would have been printed in the United States at this time, but they are distributed in Canada and not available in the US. Love this background with the green, and then you have the gray cardstock. Very sharp. Next up is this 1954 Parkhurst card of Hall of Fame left winger Bert Olmsted, known as Dirty Birdie because he hit hard and was known to knock guys around in the corners. He played from 1948 to 1962 in the Blackhawks, Canadiens, and Maple Leafs. He was a very good passer, finishing second in the 1950s in assists with 333 and was in sixth place in points with 463. The 54 Parkhurst is known for some beautiful game action photography, and this card is no exception. It also has these beige borders you'll see a lot of times because with age they start to tone, which I think gives the card a nice added character. In a moment here, I'm going to show you what the back of the card looks like. You can see here it's a fairly plain back, but it has a lot of detailed information as well as the English and the French translations, which give you an idea of just why the cards were distributed in Canada. You had the French and the English audience. I also have a Slab Sharks holder on it because, like I mentioned, I buy a lot of cards in Canada, and Slab Sharks is a Canadian seller. Now, the last card I want to show today is this 1953 Parkhurst Al Rollins in a KSA 6. This is probably my favorite of the group. Now, KSA is a Canadian grading company, and they have a reputation, it's said, for overgrading by a grade on a lot of their cards. But I think this is a really strong example, and I paid about $35 for it in a bundle with the Olmsted card. So I'm thrilled with it. Al Rollins is not a Hall of Famer, but he was an excellent goaltender, winning the Vezina Trophy as the league's best goalie in 1951. But what's crazy is that he won the Hart Trophy as the league MVP in 1954, in spite of having a 12-47 record. That's right, he lost a league-leading 47 games and still won the MVP. Of course, that would not happen today, but back then they thought that he was still a difference maker on that team, even though they were awful. One of the writers said, imagine if he wasn't on that team, how bad they would be. This is just a beautiful example, just a nice artwork on this card, game action shot, no face mask like the goalies didn't wear back in the day, and it really captures the essence of what hockey was during that time frame. So that's all I have today. I wanted to share my collection with you and where I'm heading with these 1950s and 60s cards. I hope everybody has a wonderful Thanksgiving.